I'm going to go ahead and film the disclaimer here. Graphic content, graphic description of crime scenes, mentions of rape and sexual assault. So, if any of that is not something you think you can stomach or handle in this 16-page document, then now's the time to exit, and we'll be right back. William George Bonin was also known as the Freeway Killer, and was an American serial killer and sex offender who committed the rape, torture, and murder of a minimum of 21 young men and boys in a series of killings in Southern California from May of 1979 to June 1980. Ha! That's when you were born. May of 1979.
I was. Why you telling people how old I am? I'm like ancient.
On at least 12 occasions, Bonin was assisted by one of his 4 known accomplices. He is also suspected of committing a further 15 murders. Described by the prosecutor at his first trial as the most arch-evil person who ever existed, Bonin was convicted of 14 of the murders linked to the Freeway Killer in 2 separate trials in 1982 and 1983. He spent 14 years on death row before he was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison in 1996. Bonin was the first inmate in California to die by this method. Bonin became known as the Freeway Killer, as well as the Freeway Strangler, due to the fact that the majority of his victims were discovered along numerous freeways in Southern California. He shares this epithet with 2 separate and unrelated serial killers active in and around Southern California in the 1970s, Patrick Kearney and Randy Kraft. William George, or Bill, Bonin was born in Willimantic, Connecticut on January 8, 1947, the second of 3 sons, each of whom were 3 years apart, born to Robert Leonard Bonin Sr., 1919 to 1980, and Alice Dorothy Bonin, 1920 to 2004. Bonin's parents were both alcoholics. His father was an ill-tempered war veteran and gambling addict who was frequently physically abusive towards his wife in the presence of his children. Sounds like a nice guy. And who is known to have occasionally beaten his sons during his wife's absence. In contrast, his mother was an overbearing, codependent, and passive woman who suffered from wild mood swings and who spent much of her free time at the bingo parlor, often as her sons remained unattended at the family home. Consequently, the siblings were severely neglected as children, with their parents seldom present in the household. In spite of this dysfunctional environment, Bonin and his brothers were actively raised Catholic by their parents and baptized according to church doctrine. In 1953, Bonin's mother placed Bonin and his younger brother in a Catholic convent in an apparent effort to protect her children from the ongoing domestic violence within the family. This convent was known to severely discipline the children and housed for major and minor breaches of conduct, with punishments administered including harsh beatings and during various stress positions, repeatedly pacing staircases until exhausted and partial drowning in sinks filled with ice water. Now there's discipline and then there's child abuse, and I honestly think this was just, child abuse more than anything. In more extreme cases, orphans are alleged to have faced assaults which included having their heads dunked in toilets, being beaten until bloodied, and being threatened with knives. During these forms of mistreatment, contemporary records indicate that Bonin, a typically troublesome child, was observed by officials to function well under the controlled environment of this convent. Maybe he should have stayed there. Just saying. He needed discipline, and he really didn't get that. And that's unfortunate. But I don't see it as an excuse, obviously, to murder people. But he didn't get what he needed growing up. That much we can all agree on. Although Bonin later freely discussed many aspects of his childhood, he largely refused to discuss his memories of the 3 years he spent at this convent, beyond divulging on one occasion that by 1955 he had become fearful of an older boy and had consented to his sexual advances only by allowing him to first tie Bonin's hands behind his back. I don't know why I got tongue twisted there. He also denied any other memories of the alleged abuse he and other orphans may have been subjected to. As neither parent visited Bonin or his brother at the convent, he gradually began to believe his parents were dead. Bonin was to remain at the convent until 1956, when he returned to live with his parents in the town of Mansfield, Connecticut. In 1957, Bonin was arrested for stealing tags from vehicle license plates. He was placed in a juvenile detention center for these offenses and various other minor crimes. While housed at this juvenile detention center, he was molested by an adult counselor who had been assigned to control and monitor the juvenile offenders. Following Bonin's release from the detention home, he began sexually fondling his younger brother. By his teenage years, Bonin had developed an unrelenting and obsessive interest in pedophilia, also discovering that he was homosexual upon puberty. His sexuality later became the basis of a long-standing conflict with his mother, who believed his sexual inclinations towards young boys to be a curable social disorder. As such, the two frequently argued about his homosexual attraction. Very seldom, Bonin attempted to publicly court and or interact with females as an adolescent. On one occasion, he was humiliated and rejected by a girl whom he had worked up his courage to approach and ask for a date. This incident wounded his self-esteem and increased Bonin's belief that he just couldn't make it with girls. As romantic partners, he resolved to never allow a female to hurt him this deeply again. Following these events, Bonin was reported to have molested several neighborhood children while the family lived on Angel Street or Angel Street. Not sure of that one. Bonin's mother, allegedly extremely emotionally controlling and protective of her son, is known to have refused to acknowledge these acts of molestation, as well as the general escalating antisocial behavior. Nonetheless, Bonin's mother noted to have displayed extreme disappointment and contempt for her middle son's sexuality and actions. She's known to have evicted her son from the household on at least one occasion for undisclosed reasons. And here we go again. We're going to get into this, and I say this every time. He served in the Air Force. They all have military background. Everyone I do has a military background, except maybe the women. In 1965, Bonin's mother persuaded him to join the United States Air Force. He served 5 months of active duty in 205th Assault Support Helicopter Unit during the Vietnam War as an aerial gunner, logging over 700 hours of combat and patrol time. Bonin was to later claim that his experiences in Vietnam instilled a belief within him that human life is overvalued and that humans generally overestimate their value in society, stating, "You learn that life is cheap over there." Despite this, he is known to have risked his own life on one occasion while under enemy fire to save the life of a wounded fellow airman. For this act, Bonin received a medal in recognition of his gallantry, among other medals. According to Bonin, he engaged in sexual relations with both males and females in Vietnam. And although he also confessed to sexually assaulting 2 soldiers under his command at gunpoint during the period of the Tet Offensive. That's always fun. Yeah, okay. On November 17th, 1968, Bonin confronted a 14-year-old youth before handcuffing, stripping, and beating the teenager into semi-consciousness. While threatening to sodomize and murder him. The youth was then sodomized before being released on November 24th. Bonin abducted and handcuffed a 17-year-old youth whom he then sodomized. During this assault, Bonin also bludgeoned the boy with a tire iron in addition to traumatizing his testicles by squeezing. 5 weeks later, on January 1st, 1969, Bonin forced a 12-year-old boy whom he had abducted to orally copulate him before further molesting the child. He then threatened to kill this victim if he ever reported the incident. On January 12th, Bonin abducted and handcuffed an 18-year-old youth who was extensively beaten before being forced to orally copulate Bonin. This victim was also sodomized. In January 1969, Bonin was arrested as he attempted to restrain an intended 5th victim, a 16-year-old whom he lured into his vehicle before handcuffing. He was indicted on 5 counts of kidnapping, 4 counts of sodomy, 1 count of oral copulation, and 1 count of child molestation. Against 5 individuals he had abducted and assaulted, or in the case of the final youth he had abducted, attempted to assault since the previous November. In each instance, Bonin had handcuffed or otherwise restrained his victim before forcibly engaging in sodomy, oral copulation, and methods of torture, which included bludgeoning her about the head with a tire iron, choking one victim until he had near unconsciousness, and the squeezing of 2 of his victim's testicles. Bonin pleaded guilty to molestation and forced oral copulation, and was sentenced to Ostasiderio, it's probably not correct, State Hospital as a mentally disordered sex offender, considered amenable to treatment in January 1971. Bonin was released from prison on June 11, 1974, after doctors concluded he was no longer a danger to the health and safety of others. Needless to say, we're here. We're talking about it. We know they were wrong. 3 months after Bonin's release from prison on September 8, 1974, he encountered David Allen McVicker, 14, hitchhiking in the city of Garden Grove. David accepted Bonin's offer to drive him to his parents' home in Huntington Beach. Shortly after David entered Bonin's Opel Kadett, he asked the teenager whether he had engaged in homosexuality or was homosexual. David replied that he had not, asking to leave the vehicle, prompting Bonin to accelerate the car. When David attempted to leave the car, Bonin produced a gun and drove David to a deserted field, ordering the teenager to undress before raping him as he simultaneously strangled him with his t-shirt and a tire iron in the front seat of his car. With little breath left, David pleaded for his life, stating, "God help." Bonin immediately ceased his assault and apologized before reverting to casual conversation. He then drove David to his home, stating on the way, "You know what? You're an alright guy. I was going to kill you, but I want to come back for you and use you again." End quote. As David was leaving Bonin's vehicle, Bonin further remarked, "We'll meet again." David cried for several hours before calling a child abuse hotline. I mean, totally fair. He then phoned his mother, who immediately drove home from work and informed Garden Grove police of the incident. Months later, Bonin was arrested for the 2 assaults on October 11, 1975. When arrested, he informed law enforcement that, quote, "Next time there won't be any more witnesses," end quote. He was not wrong. He was subsequently charged with the rape and forcible oral copulation of a minor and the attempted abduction of a 15-year-old boy, which had occurred 2 days after Bonin's assault on McVicker. In the second instance, Bonin had sexually propositioned the teenager who had rejected Bonin's offer of $35 for sex before abruptly exiting his van. The boy had told Bonin to get out of here. In response, Bonin drove the van onto the sidewalk in an attempt to strike the youth with his vehicle. Talk about being extra. Like, just let it go. Okay. Bonin pleaded guilty to both charges. In December 31st, 1975, he was sentenced to serve between 1 and 15 years imprisonment at the California Men's Facility and San Luis Obispo. In 1977, Bonin was subject to further psychiatric examination. The results of this evaluation indicated
You can do it. You can do that.
indicated his sexual involvement with young boys related to his mother's micromanagement of his life. Although Bonin denied any culpability of this conviction to fellow inmates as a convicted child molester, he was beaten on several occasions while incarcerated for this offense. Yeah, like he should have been. Bonin was released from detention on October 11, 1978. Albeit with 18 months supervised probation. Upon his release, Bonin moved to an apartment complex at the Kingswood Village complex in Downey, located approximately 1 mile from his parents' house. He soon established a reputation among teenage boys in his neighborhood as a gregarious individual who bought alcohol for minors and allowed them to socialize in his apartment. In late 1978, Bonin became acquainted with a 43-year-old neighbor and ex-bank officer named Everett Scott Frazier. Bonin became a regular attendee at Frazier's parties, held almost every night of the week for the next several months, where young men, drugs, and alcohol were rife. Because that's where he needed to be. You know, he needed to be doing that. No, he didn't. Frazier considered Bonin a respectful, polite, and placid individual. to whom he frequently introduced his young male acquaintances, with the two exchanging stories of their homosexual exploits and penchant for sex with teenage boys. Bonin later returned to his parents' house, where he gradually developed a reputation as a child molester among local residents due to his habit of inviting young boys into the household. Well, that's odd.
I'm gonna go put you to bed.
Occasionally, as his mother, younger brother, and others were present, under the guise of providing free alcohol and viewing pornography with them. Some neighbors later recollected frequently observing young boys accompany Bonin into the residence, some of whom they would later hear screaming and crying once inside the residence. In spite of this, his mother and younger brother claimed to have never witnessed Bonin abuse any youths. By this period, Bonin's father was admitted to a veterans hospital where he would spend much of his time for various issues pertaining to his health, presumably induced by his long-standing alcohol addiction. Bonin eventually met a man named Vernon Butts, and yes, that is his real name. 21, shortly after their acquaintance, Bonin suggested the two should rape and murder a teenage hitchhiker. Butts was amenable to this suggestion and later freely admitted to taking great delight in watching Bonin abuse and torture his victims in the rear of his van as Butts drove the vehicle. Nonetheless, Butts insisted he had primarily participated in the murders out of fear of Bonin, who on one occasion had arrived at his residence unannounced after Butts had discreetly changed his address without informing him. You know, I don't know why they say it was so discreet, because you're not, by law, required to report your address to your friends if you move. And you don't want to be friends with them anymore. You don't have to tell them you moved. So I don't know why they said it had to be all discreet or whatever. You don't have to tell your friends if you move. So please know that. You don't have to. It's okay. Gregory Matthews Miley, 18, was an illiterate Texas native with the IQ of 56 who supported himself with casual work. Also actively participated in 2 murders he accompanied Bonin upon. Bonin himself later confessed to a psychologist his feeling a sense of social belonging with his accomplices and murder that he had never previously experienced with any other individuals. He found a whole cacophony of weirdos and sexual predators. Yeah. Bonin usually selected young male hitchhikers, schoolboys, or occasionally male prostitutes as his victims. The victims, aged 12 to 19, were predominantly slender, pale, long-haired youths whom he either enticed or forced into his Ford Econoline van, where they were overpowered and bound hand and foot with a combination of handcuffs and wire or cords. They were then sexually assaulted, extensively beaten about the face, torso, hand, and genitals, and tortured before typically being killed by strangulation with their own t-shirts and a tire iron while letting them fade in and out of consciousness. Although some victims were stabbed or battered to death, Bonin, one victim, Darren Kendrick, was forced to drink hydrochloric acid. 3 victims had ice picks driven into their ears, and another victim, Mark Shelton, died of shock from impaling. Impaling. What are we doing here? It's crazy. In order to minimize the chances of a potential victim escaping from his vehicle, Bonin removed all inner handles from the passenger side and rear doors of his van. He also stowed ligatures, knives, pliers, wire coat hangers, and other such instruments in his vehicle to facilitate the restraining and torture of his victims. The victims were usually killed inside his van before their bodies were discarded alongside or close to various freeways in Southern California. In an apparent effort to avoid investigators connecting his crimes, Bonin often drove to various counties to discard his victims' bodies far from the site of their abduction. Dr. Albert Rosenstein, a forensic psychologist, predicted their killer was an intelligent sex offender in his late 20s or early 30s, had spent time in a psychiatric facility, was abused as a child, and that while bisexual, the killer has never become comfortable with the homosexual side of his personality and is repulsed by his actions, as is evidenced by the gruesome mutilation of his victim. In a minimum of 12 of the murders, Bonin, who considered murder a group sport, was assisted by 1 or more of his 4 known accomplices. Scrapbooking newspaper clippings of his murders, Bonin would later hold a newspaper to accomplish Vernon Butts and acquaintance Everett Fraser, and boast of which murders he had committed. In discussion of the killings with acquaintances, Bonin remarked, "This guy is giving good gays like us a bad name." Following media coverage of his murders, Bonin also enthusiastically mentioned his killings to fellow co-workers at Dependable Drive-Away, stating he did it again. They found another one, a strangler victim. To those unaware of his crimes, Bonin, who made daily trips to Orange County to buy newspapers, reportedly seemed obsessed with the case. They usually are. The first murder for which Bonin was charged was that of Thomas Glenn Lundgren, 13. Lundgren was last seen leaving his parents' house in Reseda at 10:50 a.m. on May 28, 1979. Shortly before his abduction, Lundgren had reportedly told friends a man had offered to meet him at a skate park to take photos from for a skateboarding magazine. His body, clad only in a t-shirt, shoes, and socks, was found the same afternoon in Agora. An autopsy revealed that Lundgren had suffered emasculation and extensive bludgeoning to his face and head, with his skull sustaining multiple fractures. In addition, the youth had been slashed across the throat, extensively stabbed about the chest and stomach, and strangled to death. His underwear, jeans, and severed genitals, bearing several bite marks, were discovered strewn in a field close to his body. Sorry, I coughed. An expert later postulated that Bonin's brutality was likely an attempt to kill his homosexual... I don't know why that went off. And I hate when my phone goes off because it messes me up. And the abduction and... No. Okay, an expert later postulated that Bonin's brutality was likely an attempt to kill his homosexual attraction to Thomas, further silencing his desire with each subsequent stabbing. In the abduction and murder of Thomas, Bonin was assisted by Butts, who was suspected of accompanying or assisting Bonin on at least 8 further murders attributed to the Freeway killer. In August 1979, Bonin was again detained for molesting a a 17-year-old boy in the coastal community of Dana Point. This violation of the conditions of his parole should have resulted in Bonin being returned to prison. However, an administrative error committed prior to Bonin's scheduled court date resulted in his release. Frazier drove to collect Bonin from the Orange County Jail where he had been incarcerated. He later recollected that as he drove Bonin home, Bonin made a statement which Frazier had interpreted at the time as an expression of remorse. "No one's going to testify again. This is never going to happen to me again." Resuming his murder spree, Bonin did not bother to appear for his court appointment. 2 months after the murder of Thomas, on August 4th, 1979, Bonin and Butts abducted Mark Shelton, 17, shortly after he left his Westminster home to walk to a movie theater near Beach Boulevard. Screams were heard from the vicinity of the Shelton household by neighbors, leaving a strong possibility Mark was abducted by force. The youth was violated with foreign objects, including a stick, causing his body to enter a state of shock, which proved fatal. His body was then discarded in San Bernardino County. The following day, Bonin and Butts encountered a West German student named Marcus Grabs, 17, between 6 and 10 p.m., attempting to hitchhike from the Pacific Coast Highway. Marcus was bound with lengths of cord and ignition wire, then beaten and sodomized as Butts drove towards Bonin's home, where the youth was again sodomized and beaten. Marcus was subsequently partially strangled, then stabbed a total of 77 times, again postulated by various experts in an attempt to kill his homosexuality, before his nude body was discarded in Malibu Creek, close to Las Virginias Canyon Road. His body was found at approximately 6:30 a.m. the following morning, with one investigator likening the network of injuries inflicted upon the victim to that of a rabid dog, unable to determine when to cease biting. On August 20th, 1979, Bonin left the corpse of a John Doe to be found in Los Angeles. On August 27th, Bonin and Butts abducted a Hollywood youth named Donald Ray Hayden, 15. Hayden was last seen alive walking along Santa Monica Boulevard at 1 a.m. His body was found by construction workers later that same morning in a dumpster located near the off-ramp of the Ventura Freeway. Prior to his death, by ligature strangulation, Hayden had been bound, beaten about the face, sodomized, and stabbed in the neck and genitalia and bludgeoned about the skull. Evident attempts had also been made to remove his testicles and slash his throat, and his rectum was found bleeding and extensively distended, leading a coroner to opine he had been impaled by a large object. 2 weeks after the murder of Hayden, on September 9th, Bonin and Butts encountered a La Mirada youth, David Louis Murillo, 17, cycling to a movie theater. Luring the youth into Bonin's van, they parked the vehicle at a secluded spot where he was bound, repeatedly raped by Bonin and Butts, extensively bludgeoned about the skull with the tire iron, then strangled with the ligature before his nude body was thrown out of the van and over an embankment into a bed of ivy alongside Highway 101. 8 days after the murder of Murillo, a Newport Beach youth named Robert Christopher Wyverstek, 18, was abducted as he cycled to his job at a grocery store. His body was found on September 27th alongside Interstate 10. Bonin is not known to have killed again until on or about November 1st, 1979, when he and Butts abducted and murdered an unidentified young man with brown hair between 5'1" and 5'6", and estimated to be between 15 and 27 years old. This victim was savagely beaten, then strangled to death before his fully clothed body was discarded in an irrigation ditch alongside State Route 99, south of Bakersfield. During the ordeal, Bonin allegedly asked his victim whether he knew why he had to die. He then further explained why, stating, quote, "Your folks paid us to find you and kill you," end quote. Bonin strangled the youth before inserting an ice pick into his nostrils and right ear. Approximately 40 weeks later, on November 30th, Bonin, operating alone, abducted a Bellflower youth named Frank Dennis Fox, 17. During the process of ligature strangulation, Bonin had killed the youth while still sodomizing him. His body was found 2 days later alongside the Ortega Highway, 5 miles east of San Juan Capistrano. The body bore signs of extensive blunt force trauma to the face and head, with ligature marks on the wrists and ankles indicating Frank had been bound throughout his ordeal. No clothing or other identifying evidence was discovered at the scene. 10 days after the murder of Frank, A Long Beach youth named John Frederick Kilpatrick, 15, disappeared after leaving his parents' home to socialize with friends. Kilpatrick was strangled to death before his body was discarded in a remote area of Rialto. His body was found on December 13th. Kilpatrick remained known as John Doe until August 5th, 1980, because Kilpatrick, a troubled youth whose parents had recently divorced, was known to disappear for days at a time. His mother hesitated to report the disappearance. His friends also mistakenly reported seeing him at the mall. As a result, he was not reported missing until February. Your kid went missing in December. Who waits until February to be like, this is odd? On January 1st, 1980, Bonin brutalized and strangled an Ontario youth named Michael Francis McDonald, 16. His fully clothed body was found alongside Highway 71 in western San Bernardino County 2 days after his murder, although his body was not identified until March 24th. On the morning of February 3rd, 1980, Bonin invited a 16-year-old boy into his parents' house to drink and engage in intercourse. When Bonin briefly departed to urinate, he allegedly caught the youth stealing $100 from his billfold. Furious at the teenager's denial, Bonin resolved to commit a murder. Later that evening, Bonin drove from Downey to Hollywood in the company of Gregory Miley, with the specific intention of committing a murder with Miley's assistance. The pair encountered Charles Miranda, 15, standing close to the Starwood nightclub, hitchhiking along Santa Monica Boulevard. According to Miley, Bonin and Charles engaged in consensual intercourse in the rear of the van as he drove before Bonin privily stammered to him, quote, "Kid's going to die. This kid's going to die," end quote. Miley replied stating, quote, "Why don't you just let the kid go," end quote. Bonin rejected this proposition, stating, quote, "No, because he'll know us and know the van," end quote. Charles was then overpowered by Bonin, who asked the teenager how much money he had in his possession. When Charles responded he had about $6, Bonin ordered Miley to take his wallet before proceeding to beat, then bind, and gag Charles. He then informed Charles of his being robbed earlier that day, and that though it wasn't fair, the youth was to be killed. Initially doubting Bonin, Charles began crying before proceeding to beg for his life. Bonin then began sexually assaulting Charles. Miley also attempted to rape Charles, but was unable to sustain an erection. In frustration, Miley assaulted the youth with various sharp objects before assisting Bonin in beating him. Bonin then strangled Charles to death with a t-shirt and a tire iron as Miley reportedly jumped on Charles' chest. His nude corpse was dumped shortly thereafter in an alleyway along East 2nd Street in Los Angeles. 5 minutes after the pair had discarded Charles's body, Bonin suggested to Miley, quote, "I'm horny again, let's go and do another one," end quote. Miley initially protested and said he wanted to go home, but eventually complied with Bonin's insistence. A few hours later, in Huntington Beach, the pair encountered James McCobb, 12, standing at a bus stop on the corner of Beach Boulevard and Slater Avenue. Temporarily left alone, James had been dropped off there by his older brother, who had given James money and whom he stayed with for the weekend. James was lured into Bonin's van on the promise he would be driven to his intended destination of Disneyland with the additional incentive of marijuana. According to Miley, the boy entered the rear of the van voluntarily, after which Bonin drove to a grocery store parking lot, parking the van and entering the rear of the vehicle, where he began hugging and kissing the child. He then proceeded to bind the resisting James, informing the boy that he was being kidnapped for ransom. To subdue the child, Bonin began repeatedly punching in the stomach, mouth, and leg. Miley then drove in an aimless manner for what he later described as being a very, very long distance, as he repeatedly heard James crying as Bonin raped the boy and bludgeoned him about the head with a tire iron. Bonin then forced James to sleep in his arms. Upon James's awakening, Miley joined Bonin in beating the child into unconsciousness simply because he felt like doing so, before Bonin proceeded to crush James' neck with a tire iron. Bonin then strangled James to death with his own t-shirt before the pair discarded his corpse alongside a dumpster at a construction site in Walnut City. James's body was discovered 3 days later, fully clothed, bearing several skull fractures and a bruised penis. Following the murder of James, Bonin and Miley spent the money retrieved from his wallet for lunch. One day after Charles and James's murder, Bonin was arrested for violating the conditions of his parole. He was remanded in custody at the Orange County Jail until March 4th. Should have stayed there. 10 days after Bonin's release from custody on March 14th, he abducted a Van Nuys youth named Ronald Gatlin, 18. After assaulting the youth, Bonin began hacking at Ronald's face with an ice pick. Ronald was beaten and sodomized, suffering several deep, perforating ice pick wounds to the ear and neck before being strangled with the ligature. He also bore signs of extensive beating. The following day, his bound body was found behind an industrial building in the city of Duarte. 1 week later, on March 21st, Bonin lured Glenn Norman Baker, 14, into his van as the teenager hitchhiked from school to visit a friend. Glenn was warned by family to not hitchhike, but accepted Bonin's ride as he had spent the bus money his mother gave him. Glenn was also raped, beaten, violated with foreign objects, then strangled to death with a ligature, with his body also bearing evidence of numerous burns around the neck and a looping pattern which had been inflicted with a lit cigarette and an extensively distended rectum. At approximately 4:07 p.m. the same day, Russell Dwayne Pugh, 15, was abducted from a bus stop in Garden Grove. Rue intended on hitchhiking a ride to his job at a fast food restaurant before encountering Bonin. He was bound, beaten, and strangled to death after an estimated 8 hours of captivity before his body was discarded alongside that of Barker in Cleveland National Forest, close to the Ortega Highway. The teenagers' nude bodies were found on March 23rd, both bearing evidence of extensive beating and ligature marks on their wrists, ankles, and neck. One Friday evening in March 1980, Bonin offered William Ray Pugh, 17, a ride home as the pair left Frazier's residence. Within minutes of accepting the ride, Bonin asked William whether he would like to engage in sex with him. William later stated he panicked and stuttered upon hearing this question, and after sitting in silence for several minutes, attempted to leave the vehicle once Bonin slowed the van at a stoplight. In response, Bonin seized William by the collar, dragging him back into his passenger seat. According to William, Bonin entered an irritable state before confiding in him that he enjoyed abducting young male hitchhikers on Friday and Saturday nights, so he had time to take his girlfriend roller skating on Sundays, adding that he restrained and abused youths before strangling them to death with their own t-shirts. In a matter-of-fact tone, Bonin then informed William, quote, "If you want to kill somebody, you should make a plan and find a place to dump the body before you even pick a victim," end quote. Bonin further explained that he had not chosen to refrain from sexually assaulting and murdering William out of sentiment. He had been spared because the pair had been seen leaving Frazier's party together. William was driven to a home he claimed was his before fearfully sprinting to his residence upon the van's departure. On March 25, 1980, Bonin and William abducted a runaway named Harry Todd Turner, 15, from a Los Angeles street. Turner had absconded from a boys' home in the desert community of Lancaster 4 days prior to his meeting Bonin and William. Pugh was to later testify that he and Bonin lured Harry into Bonin's van with an offer of $20 for sex. After binding and sodomizing the youth, Bonin bit into Turner's penis until it tore and bled. Bonin then ordered Pugh to beat him up. After Pugh had bludgeoned and beat Turner about the head and body for several minutes, Bonin strangled the teenager to death with his own t-shirt and a tire iron before discarding his body at the rear delivery door to a Los Angeles business. Harry's autopsy subsequently revealed his genitals had been mutilated and he had received a total of 8 fractures to the skull inflicted by a blunt instrument before he had been strangled. On April 10th, Bonin was discharged from parole following his March 4th, 1980 release. He encountered a Bellflower youth named Stephen John Wood, 16, walking to school. Stephen had previously been introduced to Bonin by his older brother and willingly entered Bonin's van. His nude, hog-tied, and extensively beaten body was discarded in a Long Beach alleyway beside a dumpster, with his head resting against a nearby bench close to the Pacific Coast Highway. Stephen's autopsy revealed the youth had been killed by ligature strangulation. Prior to disposing of Stephen's body, Bonin allegedly drove to a scheduled job interview before eating pizza, as he awaited the onset of dusk to safely discard the corpse.
If you have the money and it lets me do it, there's 8 spots.
4 weeks later, on April 29th, Bonin encountered a supermarket employee named Darren Kendrick, 19, well parked in the grounds of the Stanton supermarket where Darren worked. Bonin lured Darren into his van on the pretext of selling the youth drugs. Bonin then drove to Butt's apartment in Lakewood, where the trio began listening to music as they sat on the couch. Bonin soon asked Darren whether he was gay, prompting the teenager to flee from the apartment. Darren was then overpowered and bound by both men before being sodomized by Butts as Bonin raised the volume of Butts' sound system to silence Darren's screams. Butts then held Darren's mouth open while Bonin poured chloral hydrate down his throat, causing Darren to sustain caustic chemical burns to his mouth, chin, stomach, and chest. The kid started fading out, just kind of whimpering. Bonin later said, quote, "The kid started fading out, just kind of whimpering. I don't like raping some limp piece of meat. It's no fun if they don't let me know how it feels. Guess we gave him too much stuff. Next time I figured I wouldn't use as much. Anyways, I'd gotten my rocks off and the kid was getting boring. No fun anymore, so I strangled him." End quote. Darren, who had fiercely fought his attackers, including biting the two men, then halted his resistance as he vomited onto the apartment floor before complaining of dizziness. Noting that Darren was losing consciousness and whimpering, Bonin achieved orgasm. He then strangled Darren as Butts drove an ice pick into Darren's ear, causing a fatal wound to the youth's cervical spinal cord. His body was discarded behind a warehouse close to the Artesia Freeway with the ice pick still protruding from his ear. On May 12, 1980, Bonin abducted and murdered an acquaintance whom he later stated he had decided to kill when he had awoken that morning because he was tired of having him around. The body of his acquaintance, Lawrence Sharp, 17, was discarded behind a Westminster gas station. His body was found on May 18th, and his autopsy revealed that in addition to being bound and sodomized, Lawrence had been extensively beaten about the face and body, then strangled with ligature. 1 week after the murder of Sharp, on the afternoon of May 19th, Bonin asked Butts to accompany him on a killing. On this occasion, however, Butts reportedly refused to accompany him. Operating alone, Bonin abducted a Southgate youth named Sean King, 14, from a bus stop in Downey. King was strangled to death before his body was discarded in Live Oak Canyon, Eusapia. Bonin then visited Butts' residence and bragged for the killing to his accomplices. Other murders included a homeless drifter named James Michael Monroe, 18, and Stephen J. Wells, 18. After 9 days of uneventful surveillance in which Bonin worked at Dependable Drive-Away, visited friends, and returned to his residence, on June 11, 1980, police observed Bonin driving in a seemingly random manner throughout Hollywood, unsuccessfully attempting to lure 5 separate teenage boys into his van before succeeding in luring a youth into his vehicle. The police followed Bonin until his van parked in a service station parking lot close to the Hollywood Freeway, then discreetly approached the vehicle. Upon hearing muffled screams and banging sounds emanating from inside the van, these plainclothes officers forced their way into the vehicle, discovering Bonin in the act of raping a 17-year-old Orange County runaway named Harold Eugene Tate, whom he had handcuffed and bound. He confessed to his involvement in the crimes and turned on his accomplices, Butts and Miley. On July 31st, Monroe was arrested in his hometown of Port Huron, Michigan. On August 22nd, Miley was arrested in Texas. Bonin was brought to trial in Los Angeles County on October 19, 1981. He was tried before Superior Court Judge William Keene. The trial commenced on November 5, 1981. Miley and Monroe testified against Bonin, describing in graphic detail the murders in which they had accompanied Bonin. On November 24th, a prison inmate named Lloyd Douglas testified that Bonin had bragged to him of his culpability in the Freeway killer murders, while both were incarcerated in the Los Angeles County Jail in the summer of 1980. According to Douglas, Bonin had held a newspaper article aloft before saying to him, "These are the little boys I got a hold of." Closing arguments lasted from December 16th to the 22nd, 1981. Defense attorney Chavette began his closing argument on December 21st. On January 6, 1982, the jury convicted Bonin of 10 of the murders for which he was tried, although was found not guilty of the murders of Lundgren and King, of committing sodomy upon Grabs, of committing mayhem upon Lundgren, and of robbing one other victim. Following his Orange County convictions, Bonin was transferred from the Orange County Jail to San Quentin State Prison to await execution in the gas chamber. Bonin was executed by lethal injection inside the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison on February 23, 1996. He was the first person to be executed by lethal injection in the history of California, as execution occurred 14 years after his first death sentence had been imposed. That is the story of William George Bonin. It was pretty graphic. So, yeah, y'all know why I took that break after writing this series, or this particular segment, I mean. But as always, please don't do anything I wouldn't do. Make good choices. And be cautiously kind to others. Have a wonderful day. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Bye.